Thank you, everybody, for attending this session. We have 30 minutes where Sergeant Melissa Kelly from Merseyside Police is going to be talking to us about body-worn video attendance during COVID-19. I'm Dr. Matthew Jones from the Open University, and I'll be chairing the session. Just a few housekeeping issues. So if you can make sure that your mic is on mute and your camera is turned off. And during the presentation, if you have any questions that you'd like to put into the mix for the last 10 minutes for Q&A, if you can write that in the question box, and then we'll select questions from there. Other than that, I just want to formally welcome Melissa and thank her for her contribution today, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone for joining me today and for signing up to this workshop. It's a real privilege for me to be given the opportunity to speak to you about body-worn video VA during the pandemic. I've been advised that all delegates are fully conversant with body-worn video VA, so I don't want to spend time discussing that because it'll eat into the half an hour. So if we could load the presentation, please, and I'll introduce how body-worn video came about into Merseyside. Thank you. I'm just going to take control of the presentation. Okay, so we were already using voluntary attendance strongly, averaging around 500 or 600 VAs a month. The issue with station-based VA is that it was occasionally limited by availability, and a gap was starting to form between station-based VA and the demand for a contemporaneous, more dynamic interview. Changes to legislation in July 2018, specifically Code E, placed a duty on the police to use an authorised recording device on all PACE interviews, where there was such equipment available and where an interview room or other suitable location for that use was available. So whilst this narrowed the potential to use contemporaneous interviews to record suspect interviews, it also opened up a door when you consider that the definition of authorised recording device was interpreted as including body-worn video equipment. So we put all this together and came up with a product now known as body-worn video VA and commenced pilots to test the proof of concept. We started those around December 2018. We took learning points from each pilot, positives and negatives, and kept expanding the scope of it through each pilot. And eventually in around summer 2019, we went to a successful force-wide rollout for any strand to be able to use this technique for any location, any time and any offence. The beauty of this is that all officers were already equipped with body-worn video VA, they were trained, they knew how to switch it on and off and how to download it. So there was no extra investment needed, and training could therefore be entirely focused on the requirements of the interview, ensuring that we complied with the codes, risk assessments, suitability of location, etc. So for us, it was a low investment for a really good outcome. The uptake has been good and it has filled that demand for interviews away from a police station. So when the pandemic hit in 2020, public services had to respond. So an inbuilt resilience is the key to hitting the ground running. The title of this slide is designed to say it all really. Policing had to operate with business as usual, despite what was happening around us. We needed to deliver the same efficient service to our communities and maintain confidence, but we couldn't compromise safety during the pandemic. We couldn't stop progressing crime. We couldn't shut our doors and work from home. We needed to police physically. We couldn't introduce backlogs, which would grind policing to a halt post-pandemic. We had to keep things moving, couldn't afford to worry about it later. You also cannot delay threat, harm and risk until COVID has passed, which meant that an unacceptable reduction of safeguarding would have occurred if we weren't able to continue with business as usual. And finally, custody, it couldn't revert to being the default option of the safest source of an interview. Although it has coped and responded very well during COVID, we actually more than ever wanted to keep people out of custody suites. One asymptomatic COVID suspect has the capacity to potentially infect a whole suite. So you could lose all the staffing in there, and you could also start to infect some of the suspects. So it was really, really key to try and keep people out of police stations as best as possible. So looking at body-worn video, it became an unforeseen pandemic resilience in respect to the fact that we weren't expecting the pandemic. The benefits that were anticipated pre-COVID ended up creating the pandemic resilience. The positive factors on the left here in white created COVID secure methods in red. So body-worn video responded well to this unforeseen critical event. The interviews were portable and dynamic because they were able to be taken away from a police station. We were allowed to interview vulnerable suspects at home, so not removing people from appropriate adults, from their medication, from the carers. That's a real key thing on any given year, but during the pandemic, people that are shielding or perhaps a little bit uncertain about leaving their home, it gave us scope to still continue and still progress criminal investigation. And then the key one, reduced demand on station-based VA suites. These could often be at full capacity during our peak times, Monday to Friday, 9 to 7 or our peak hours. Having people in and out of these buildings, touching light switches, desks, doors, handles, it now feels alien that we would consider that in a post-pandemic world, but that allowed us scope to interview away from police buildings, taking more control over our social distancing, infection control, and allowing even for consideration of larger interview rooms. Some VA suites can be quite small, and if you think there could potentially be five people in that room at any one time, could be 2 interviewing officers, a suspect, an appropriate adult and a solicitor in there. So we want to try and, if we have to have everybody together, increase the size of the room that we're working in. It was actually recognised by the HMIC during the COVID-19 inspections that our force had responded by using alternative interviewing techniques, such as body-worn video VA. And they also picked up on the fact that body-worn video allows interviews to be sent via a digital portal to the CPS. So as with our digital interviews in the station, there is no need to burn off discs. So we're reducing, again, the tangible items that we're touching and passing potentially virus on, but also it just increases that efficiency, and actually post-interview retains the same efficiency as a station-based interview. So I thought I'd discuss the trends of its usage with you as well during the pandemic. We've taken data from May of last year because this is the point at which we really started to keep accurate records. POCD is our main usage of body-worn video VA. It averages about 57% of all of its usage. Our main users are frontline officers. Local policing account for 45% of its usage, so they are our neighbourhood patrol officers and our tactical teams. And then following close second is our investigation teams and our response sections. We are actually now seeing an increasing usage in our response teams, so it is very firmly fitting into that frontline function that it was initially designed for. It does have a much wider scope, but it fits in very nicely with frontline usage. The graph on the left is purely body-worn video usage. I've put that in big so that you can see that it has shown some fluctuation. There are 2 major dips, one in August and one in December. The August dip, I think, is probably mainly due to abstractions through annual leave. It was still quite normal by August last year. The world was operating in a more pre-pandemic way. People were still going on holiday. It can make suspects quite difficult to get hold of during that period, as well as they're possibly out of the country. But the December dip, the largest one, that does start to correlate with the second wave of COVID. More people shielding, more people isolating at home, coupled with the December demand on policing. I think that explains that dip. But if you look at the graph on the right, if you look at the trend line for body-worn video, which is the blue graph at the bottom, it is showing a very linear trend. It's showing less sensitivity towards fluctuation and actually proving its resilience in that frontline usage. The orange graph at the top, which represents overall VA, which includes mainly station-based VA, does actually show a decline throughout COVID. This could be to do with the fact that crime has fallen slightly during the pandemic, but also for the aforementioned reasons, a station-based interview would be less attractive. People could be harder to get hold of during that time, and if you're suffering staff abstraction as well, you are going to see an overall dip. But the linear trend line of body-worn video usage through the pandemic, I feel does demonstrate that it has proved to be fairly stable. So overall, the wider resilience of body-worn video was more than what we envisaged in the first place. It captures best evidence, Code F, which governs visually recorded suspect interviews, does state that the best evidence is visually recorded evidence. The safeguarding that affords to all parties concerned is obvious. It reduces demand on the police estate, which was a good thing before the pandemic, but actually has become critical during the pandemic to keep people out of police buildings. It's kept things moving, prevented backlogs, and it's actually free from system or power failure, which leads us on to potentially other critical factors that could affect suspect interviews. Creates options outside of station-based interviews and truly agile policing. Officers can take everything they need with them out on patrol. And for us, it's been smarter policing with little extra investment. The infrastructure was already there. All our officers had body cams and were trained in it. We just added on to the function of that body camera in an innovative way. And also, it's worth highlighting that this generates the highest positive outcome rate compared to arrest and station-based VAs. I've just done a 9-month assessment, and that's come out at 83% of all body-worn videos returning a positive outcome, which actually is above our other methods of suspect interview, so another positive. So I thought I'd look at where the future may take us with body-worn video VA. The pandemic has taught us all that we don't know what's around the corner. We must future-proof systems and work in methods to make things smarter and more efficient. I am currently working on a Pronto app for our handheld devices. So again, all of our frontline staff are equipped with handheld devices. They are fully competent in their usage. They're already being used effectively for other policing functions, such as recording stop searches, use of force, criming. So we're going to look to, again, tap into that. Little extra investment in the way of infrastructure. We already have the devices. This will then speed up the process further by automating more steps and digitising the process more, which means less inputting for the officers later. The other positive of that is it allows instant access remotely. So, for example, our police decision makers, if the officer elected to perform lifetime charging at the roadside, they just need to pick up the phone, ring the police decision maker, and they would be able to see this interview straight away because the Pronto would upload that immediately. So looking ahead, this is creating resilience for other major disasters or external impacts that are beyond our control. It future-proofs in ways that we haven't yet seen or know about yet. So I've looked at events such as cyber attacks, terrorist attacks, mass public unrest of the likes that we perhaps saw during Black Lives Matter protests, more recently the Sarah Everard protests. We can see the capacity of the public to perhaps interfere with the way that we interview suspects. A cyber attack could take out our computer systems. A terrorist attack could take out our buildings. We have a system here that is independent of those factors. It does not rely on the policing estate. It does not rely on a computer in order for the officer to operate. So this slide I've just put in really because it's designed to be light-hearted and provoke thought. I actually stole it from a College of Policing presentation because I thought the message was really good. It's essentially forward planning versus wait and see. So you've got Garfield, who's just happy to sit back and see what the future holds. He doesn't mind. And then you've got John, who wants to look at the future and do something about the future. By applying innovation to suspect interviews, we created a pandemic-proof product. This demonstrates the power of continually driving forward, looking towards agile, smarter systems to aid policing. And actually, Operation Taller, the Recovery and Reform Programme, has cited the need to look at practices used during the pandemic that have had positive impacts and assess them for permanent implementation. So body-worn video may perhaps become more widespread a feature in policing as a result. I do think it has a firm place in policing. and that may be reviewed and taken forward in other directions. But where else can we look to mobilise and digitise? Can we make it so that an officer has everything they need to fight crime with them on the streets? Can we redefine the term agile working to extend beyond working from home and flexible hours, and actually look at mobilising healthy workforces in every way possible? In conclusion, we have found that an agile, technologically enabled workforce is a healthy and resilient workforce, and one that is fit for the modern era of policing, because as we've all been reminded by the pandemic, that no one actually knows what is around the corner. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to discuss any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. That's a really interesting presentation and on time as well. So well done for that. If anybody has any questions, either you can come online and put your video on and ask the question, or you can type them into the video chat. I think people are being shy. I might start with an opening question. Okay. So Melissa, I was wondering how this has been received by other stakeholders in the criminal justice system, particularly the legal profession.
Yeah, that is a question that comes up quite commonly, because it is a major concern. When you start to look at taking suspect interviews away from the police station, you do introduce elements that are beyond control sometimes. The solicitor, the legal representatives we've found have actually been very responsive to this, and particularly during the pandemic, they really have elected for processes that are more remote. As we know, the Coronavirus Act 2020 has introduced partial and virtually remote interviews, which have aided us with not having to have everybody in one room. So we haven't had so far any resistance to it or any negative reaction, but we have instilled in officers the need to ensure that rights have been given to the detainee, that they fully understand that the informality of the setting, perhaps if this is taking place away from a police station, does not detract from the severity of the investigation. It is still a police interview, and it still has the same ramifications as if they were interviewed in the police station. So I think by continuing to enforce that message and making sure that officers are prompted to discuss that with the individual, it has allayed some of the fears initially in relation to how that was going to be perceived.
Great, thank you. And there's a related question. Patrick, I'm mindful you've got a question. I'll come to you in just a second. But Susie asks, are you monitoring compliance in terms of rights being given?
Yes, we are. We monitor compliance across the board. So when I said to you, I've taken data from May, that's when we really started to implement quite robust quality assurance processes. So we do check that rights are given. For body worn video VA, we actually designed a workbook, and that's going to be what goes on to Pronto, and that prompts the officers end to end, all the way from the pre-interview checks all the way through to what they need to do post-interview. And at every point in there are prompts for the officer, so they are prompted to give the rights. And when this goes on to Pronto, what I have done is created mandatory fields. The officers will not be able to move on to the next step until the rights have been given. But we do make sure we monitor that, along with things like that they conform with ODRA checks, foreign national offender checks, risk assessments pre and post interview. So we are trying to monitor compliance at every level.
Great, thank you. Patrick, you have a question?
Just a practical, I heard you refer to the custody suites and wonder, do you have a central custody suite, or are there different police stations have different cells? I heard that you mentioned the problems of disinfecting. What happens on a Saturday night in Liverpool when all hell lets loose, as you would normally expect it to do? Where do you take the prisoners, and how do you deal with? Often, anybody who's worked in a big city knows you can end up with more prisoners than you've got cells.
Well, yeah, we have 4 operational custody suites at the moment. They are as central as possible to each of the areas, the hubs that we work. What you're asking there, I think that's that's something that I think is unavoidable. If you do have a very busy city centre, a very busy Saturday night, as you put it, you are going to end up with a higher volume of detainees. If those individuals need to be arrested for all the usual reasons Code G applies, there is a necessity to arrest them, then they would have to be arrested. What we would encourage is, if body-worn video could be used, then is it more suitable to use that? The person would of course have to be fully sober. They would have to understand the process and be in a position to comply with it. So it's another tool that we can invoke, but with regards to custody, it sometimes is unavoidable, and it's a dynamic issue that you just never know your prisoner numbers. If they went above and beyond that capacity, we'd have to look outside of Merseyside, but we tend to do a very good job of keeping within our capacity. And systems like this help with that, because it provides a secondary option of street interview. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And could I give you a secondary? That listening to you, you are talking about a different way of policing, and particularly in a large urban centre.
Yeah.
That previous practice has been to simply lock up. And yet this now will change the whole ethos of how the police deal with incidents on the street. And I just wonder what pressure that's putting on the officers.
Okay, well, for some time, I think we are a metropolitan force. We have had, we do deal with a lot of gang-related crime, serious crime, organised crime. So there will always be, arrest may only be the option in certain scenarios. There are PACE implications that can only be implemented when you're under arrest. But for quite some time now, there's been a national pressure to keep people out of custody suites. The Youth Concordat has been a major one for not looking to detain youths where we can. The NPCC discuss arrest being not punitive and not a convenience of the state, and they are things I think we have to agree with. They have been a long time coming, and they are necessary. So yes, what we have done with VA over the years is to keep driving that as an alternative source of interview where it is appropriate. But where body-worn video VA steps in is to fill that gap between the need to keep officers on the ground, to keep them moving, to keep them out of stations for efficiency reasons as much as COVID. So this has allowed officers to continue with that. We have had an example of an officer who performed 2 street interviews in very quick succession for drugs. Both returned a positive outcome. And we're still able to link in with liaison and diversion services. Even when we VA people, we have a strong connection with our criminal justice mental health teams. They are able to provide assistance to people with a wide range of vulnerabilities, gambling addictions, veterans, domestic abuse, homelessness. So none of that is lost when you do VA somebody. So I certainly do think it's something that we need to continue driving. There'll always be a need for arrest, but this is a really good secondary option to arrest.
Thank you very much.
There's a question in the chat just to ask if it's okay to contact you about this outside of the session.
Yeah, of course. I do provide some assistance to outside external forces with this, so I'm quite happy for any contacts.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, that's great. Well, all that's left for me to do is to thank Melissa for a really great and engaging presentation. The next session starts at 2:15 back in the main room. So if you can all make your way back over to there. Thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you.